Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Just going to give one or two moments for people to kind of move from the waiting room. Hello, everyone. Wonderful. Thank you for joining us today for our Providence Community webinar, a practical guide to scoping reviews, purpose and process. My name is Julie Brown. I'm a Principal Consultant Systematic Reviewer with Providence, and I'm going to be your host today for this webinar. I'm being supported in the background by Nancy Al-Shab, who's the team lead for community support, and by Joel Ronco, who's also from our community team. I'd like to introduce you to our amazing guest speaker today, who's Dr. Danielle Pollock from the University of Adelaide, who's a nationally and internationally recognized evidence synthesis methodologist and a lived experience researcher in stillbirth stigma. Danielle is a senior research fellow and a senior member of the Health Evidence, Recommendations and Impact Research Group. She's got amazing extensive experience in evidence synthesis, methodology, guideline development, and interest holder engagement. So absolutely fantastic experience there. Danielle has played a leading role in advancing scoping review methodology, and that's through establishing and coordinating, indeed, the JBI Scoping Review Network and supporting research teams around the world in the design and conduct of really high quality reviews. So it's a pleasure to have you as our guest speaker today, and welcome. Regarding housekeeping, the webinar today is recorded and all registrants will receive a link to the recording within the next 24 hours following this session. All attendees are muted, but you can ask us questions at any time. And to do that, please share your questions in the Q&A if you're on Zoom, and in the chat if you're joining us via YouTube. So one more time, questions to be asked in the Q&A if you're on Zoom, or in the chat if you're on YouTube. I'd just like to give you a really quick introduction to Providence for those of you who may not be too familiar with us. We're a not-for-profit organisation that provides a web-based end-to-end solution to streamline your scoping review. And this begins right with signing up and creating your review, importing your sources of evidence, going through screening and data charting and data extraction, so that you have your data ready for your export or analysis and synthesis. We've got an amazing team that support you throughout your journey, and we have the world's largest review community with over 650,000 users around the world. In the near future, we'll be releasing a new ebook on protocol development for scoping reviews. And you can pre-register for the free download using the QR code here. And we'll also be putting a link into the chat for you as well, so that you can access that resource once it's available. I think at Providence, we've seen a really rapid increase in the number of scoping reviews being conducted. And this is reflected in Scopus, where it's been suggested that there's been a tenfold increase in scoping reviews since 2010. And it's estimated that last year there were over 20,000 scoping reviews published in Scopus. So that's a huge interest in this type of review. And today's webinar, we have over 8,600 people registered. And so I think that's a clear reflection of the interest in scoping reviews and how they can be used. So I'm just going to launch a poll. I'd love to find out whether or not you've conducted scoping review before. So yes, have you conducted them multiple times? Maybe just once? Are you considering a scoping review? Or you're really not sure whether you need to or not? So I'll just give you a moment or two to answer that question for us. And while that's happening, I'll stop sharing and I'll allow Danielle to set her slides up. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for answering those questions. That's absolutely amazing. I'm going to end that poll now. And we have 10% who have conducted more than one scoping review, 28% who've just done one, 56% who haven't done the scoping review yet, but considering it, and 6% who are not sure whether or not a scoping review is right for them. So that's fantastic. We've got a great range of experience there, which I think is going to be really useful as we go through this webinar. So it's time for us now to find out more about scoping reviews from our expert. Now, before the webinar started and you registered, you put forward some questions and we've kind of collated those together to come up with a couple of the really most common questions amongst the many, many hundreds that were submitted. And so we're going to go through some of those now with Danielle, and then at the end, we're going to go through some of the questions that you might have submitted during the session itself. So welcome, Danielle. Thank you very much for taking your time in joining us today. And so the first question that we have for you is, how do I know my review should be a scoping review?
The question I get asked the most is my scoping review actually a scoping review? And I just want to reiterate that this is a question that I get asked the most, and it's a question that I'm glad that I get asked about because firstly, you know that there's multiple different types of reviews out there, and that you're trying to work out the best methods for your question. So I'm glad that this is the first question that you ask is, what review is actually the best review to answer the question that I need. So I've got a few slides here on how to help you determine if your review is actually a scoping review or maybe another review type. So I really want to emphasize that there are many misconceptions about scoping reviews, what they do and what they can't do. And I suppose how they then differentiate between a systematic review and a scoping review, or even just a literature review. Now, I'll probably be talking more about the systematic review versus scoping review. But I also want to emphasize here that there are many different types of systematic reviews. So I think many people aren't aware that there's systematic reviews of not just the effects of interventions, which explores harms and benefits, but there's systematic reviews of qualitative evidence, textual evidence, economics. And so before going into a scoping review question, ask, is this just another systematic review that I need to conduct rather than a scoping review? And I think it's really important because they have different purposes. One is a systematic review is not better than a scoping review, and a scoping review is not better than a systematic review. They're just different for types of evidence synthesis, and their different processes are to help really answer the different types of questions that they answer. So the questions that I kind of help myself when I'm trying to work out if my review is a scoping or a systematic review is this question and the results of these questions going to answer a clinically meaningful question or provide evidence to inform practice? Now, I find that really important because if I'm trying to change practice, then I need to make sure that I put safeguarding in place like risk of bias assessments or other forms of critical appraisal, and scoping reviews is probably not that approach. If I have a question regarding the feasibility, the appropriateness, the meaningfulness, or the effectiveness on a certain treatment or practice, then again, that is something where I need to put safeguards in place. I'm probably going to have a narrower research question, of what works or what are your experiences type of question, and they are more aligned to a systematic review. But what if I actually just want to know about certain characteristics or concepts of the papers included? So I'm more interested about what is the available evidence and what methods have they been used? Or why would I use this particular approach? So, for example, I did a scoping review with a team on patient journey mapping and the method of patient journey mapping. And they were like, why do people use this method? How do they use this method? When do they use this method? So those types of questions that are more open-ended and broader and maybe hypothesis generating would be more the scoping review. But if you're looking for more of a why should I implement this practice, or is this intervention better than another intervention, then those are clearly systematic review questions and should follow a systematic review approach. Now, don't worry, we have a few tools in place to help you with that as well, as we know that this is still quite confusing. So one of the things that we have developed is a decision tree for selecting if a scoping review is the right approach. So you go through this and you said, a synthesis of evidence is being considered. Should it be a scoping review? And then you go, is it going to inform the development of a systematic review? Because one of the reasons why scoping reviews are done is to maybe help see if there's the opportunity to do many systematic reviews, because we can often look and say, hey, this outcome is being used. We wouldn't look at the results of the outcome, but we would say this outcome is being used and it's being measured this way. And these interventions are being defined the same, or they're not being defined the same. So that leads to a systematic review. But the background questions can be a scoping review. We've got to identify the types of available evidence. So what is out there? Is it all effectiveness, like randomized controlled trials? Are we missing the voice of the parents or of consumers? What are the gaps in this research? What are the concepts? So these are types of questions. And then you go to the next one if that is a yes. And then we ask ourselves, what is your intent to use the results? And it's really important. What is the intent? And to reflect on what your question and your work is going to do. And again, if it goes to, I want this to form the basis of a clinical guideline, clinical practice, to inform policy, then I would want to make this a systematic review. But if that's not the process of that, then you're maybe looking at a scoping review. So this is part of a paper. I've got a QR code there, but I've got some other tools as well. But before I get into, is it a systematic or a scoping, remember we've got other forms of evidence synthesis as well that we need to consider. So what about how to decide between a scoping review and other forms of reviews? What about a mapping review or an evidence and gap map or even an overview? So we're not just considering, is it a scoping or systematic? We've got to consider these three things as well. So a mapping review, I would say, is a very high level, very deductive approach where you've already got defined responses already there. And if that's what you want to stick to, is very that high level deductive analysis, then you could do a mapping review. An evidence and gap map is a little different. It's a visual presentation of where the evidence is. I'll show you examples in the next slide. And an overview is a review that will help you, that will bring together other forms of evidence synthesis together. So scoping reviews can bring together any different type of evidence that you have, whether it be a randomized controlled trial or a scoping review or a systematic review or an observational study or a discussion. They can all be included in your scoping review because we're not actually extracting the results per se. So we are a bit more broader. So Just to put in perspective about what is evidence and gap map, this is one by the World Health Organization. Evidence and gap maps are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I've now created a few and I love them even more. But what the good thing is say I'm looking at an intervention. So for example, I'm looking at a self-changing cognition intervention. And then I can clearly see that there is evidence to say that there is outcomes on this intervention on social connection. I can also clearly see that there is no studies that have looked at outcomes regarding that intervention and adverse events or health service use or social cohesion. Whilst I can see here that in this intervention, which is changing cognition led by a healthcare professional, that there's quite a lot of evidence. So that I can use this to say to policymakers and say, or to people who are funding and going, well, we've got a lot of evidence here, but we are missing evidence here. So that's why we need to fill up our gap. So these help us understand some clear knowledge gaps in an area. And the other wonderful thing, and this is where you can actually then click on those circles, the bigger the circle, the bigger the evidence, and that will absolutely bring out all of the articles that have been coded there. So you can get that list. So now that you know what an evidence and gap map is, we've also tried to break this apart even further. And we've also done this in our paper on how to scoping review that was in the Journal of Clinepi. But what we've done here is essentially go, okay, if you're going to do a systematic scoping, mapping, evidence and gap map and overview, these are the key processes and these are the differences. And you'll see that a lot of the differences come from the type of question that we're asking. So scoping review, very broad question. What are the characteristics? What types of research exists on a particular area versus that very typical narrow research question that we get for a systematic review. And also, and I'll go to the next thing, I would say the level of analysis as well. So scoping reviews, you find a very inductive level analysis potentially, where you're trying to explore and it can be quite messy, but then at the end quite beautiful, versus more deductive approaches, which are the responses have already been preconceived. And again, I'm going to advocate for this tool here, and it's the Right Review tool. It's developed by the wonderful Andrea Trico and her team. And this wonderful tool allows you to be able to go through, answer a series of questions, and they can tell you exactly what review you should be doing. But it is important to understand what type of evidence, what you're trying to do. So we have the Right Review tool, and our team, led by Zach Munn, is developing the Evidence Synthesis Taxonomy Initiative, and we'll be developing a Wikipedia of all the evidence synthesis approaches as well. So those two will help support you to have the right methods with your approach. So I'm hoping this is something that I've helped clarify and demystify the difference between scoping and systematic reviews. But Julie, if there's any questions that you'd like me to answer now, I'm happy to.
I think what we'll do is we'll go through the questions that we've got and then we'll kind of collate the questions towards the end, just so that we can get through these ones that were kind of prioritized at the beginning.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But there are some great questions coming through. So thank you, everyone. Keep those being posted for us. The next question that we had was around grey literature. So scoping reviews include this, or what we're told is that they include this kind of breadth of evidence resources, and that often includes grey literature. And we do have a couple of questions that were submitted early and within the webinar so far that are asking us around kind of the process of how to search for grey literature in a scoping review and how that grey literature gets used.
Yeah, great question. The grey literature searching in scoping reviews, I think, and I think actually in any review, we forget the grey literature searching, and I think it's kind of put in the too hard, too messy basket. And I do think there needs to be better guidance on that, especially for scoping reviews, because we do include for the most part, if the question needs it, we do include a lot of grey literature. So I think with any type of searching that we do, it needs to be a transparent and a rigorous process. And that is especially if you're doing any review. So everything that you do needs to be well documented. But when you're developing a search, especially for a scoping review, it can be quite an iterative process. And that is because when we're developing our search, our questions are quite broad. And so you have to kind of go, can I title an abstract screen over 30,000 different title and abstracts? And realistically, for many people, that is not a feasible option. And so you have to keep going back and working with your librarian to work out a nice balance between a sensitive search and a specific search. And this is the time when you become best friends with your librarian. You give them any chocolate and wine that they want, because they are going to help save you a lot of time by having a nice search. So just with all scoping reviews and systematic reviews, the search strategy is quite similar in that it's very comprehensive and that it's very transparent and it's very rigorous. And just to remind everyone, a search strategy includes the initial search, and that's what you're doing in your protocol stage of your scoping review, where you're trying to develop the search, and that is when it's iterative. I hear that scoping reviews have an iterative search throughout, and that's not really the case here. It's iterative during that protocol development stage when you're testing out your search strategies. And that should be the only time that you're changing your search strategy is during your protocol stage. Then you apply that search in the phase 2, and that's when you collect all those title and abstracts. And then in the third search, you have all the list articles that you have included, and you look at those reference lists to see if there's anything you've missed. So that would be a comprehensive search. So we do that, and then we also do grey literature searching. And that's because grey literature searching can often be where our answers are rather than in, I suppose, normal peer-reviewed articles that you'll see in an academic database. And often you're doing both. But sometimes you could only do grey literature searching. So, for example, in an article by Gamble and Brown, they just wanted to include policy documents in their scoping review on hospital accreditation and midwifery care. So they searched government websites to locate them. And that was the search because that's what they needed to do. So, and then the next one was by Scott, and they explored guidelines that were easily accessible for handling storage of human breast milk through google.com, Bing, and Yahoo. Now, the reason they did that is because they wanted to know what a person who was basically managing breast milk at their home and working out what should they do. And so you'll often have the person sitting in their home, generally with a crying baby. They're not looking at PubMed, but they're looking at Google and Bing and Yahoo. Now, that's all very well and good, but how do we track that? Because we need to make our searches reproducible, and that includes grey literature searching as well. So there's a few questions that we kind of, again, ask ourselves. The first is, do I actually need to perform grey literature searching? Does my question require this? Because if your question does not require it, then don't do it. If you're looking at what the outcomes that are within a particular intervention being used by randomized controlled trials, then you're not going to get that answer in grey literature searching. So you need to really consider, do I need to do this? If you're going to do it, what kind of data are you hoping to obtain from grey literature searching? And how will this be valuable for your review? Then you need to ask yourselves, what skills and knowledge does my team have to be able to perform this search? And how will I track it? And what software am I going to be doing? So you've got to start the planning in your protocol stage, because you don't want to be making this process up as you go along, because it's a messy process. Grey literature searching is not organized. It's hard. to get this in a very transparent and rigorous way. So in your protocol, I want you to be able to list what actual websites am I looking to search for. So for example, I've got a PhD student who is looking at the involvement of people with lived experience in neurodegenerative diseases in guidelines. So she's listed a whole bunch of guideline websites where they'll be able to find guidelines like the Guideline International Network Library, and that will be part of her grey literature searching. So list it, be able to identify what you want to do before you do it. Now, if you're going to do that Google or Google Scholar search, you're going to be faced with millions of results. And again, you don't have the time to screen title and abstracts and millions of results, and it's not going to be worthy of your time. So you need to put boundaries in place. So for many people, what they do is firstly, they're going to put themselves on incognito to make sure that your previous search doesn't influence your new search. And then you're going to say, I'm going to search maybe the very first 10 pages of these results. And then after 10 pages, I'm going to determine that there is nothing relevant and I won't continue. Or I'm going to do, yes, there's still relevant information that I need to be able to find. And then I'm going to search another 10 pages. Put that process in place because we get a bit of a fear of missing out, the FOMO of missing a study, potential missing a study, and you don't need to have that in your life. So set those boundaries. And I really want to get asked this question is how do you know whether you've searched enough, particularly in grey literature searching? And I'm just going to say this, you're never going to feel like you've searched enough. You're always going to feel like you've missed a study. That's just doing reviews. But what you're going to say is I'm going to put a transparent, rigorous process in place, and I'm going to follow that process. And also, don't forget, you actually need to report all of this within your Prisma as well. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I think that's really good advice. And I think that kind of extends beyond just grey literature in terms of searching. We've had quite a few questions just come in now about, there's people's searches have generated many thousands of hits, regardless of whether it's grey literature or not. And it's really very difficult to be able to kind of process all of that. And, when you've got so many studies to go through, what do you do? Do you go back and refine your questions and go back and refine your searching? Is that what you would advise?
Yeah, I would really look and go, okay, what is my question actually asking? What results are going to help here? So looking at my question and really going and looking at the eligibility criteria. It is not possible for us to do a scoping review on absolutely everything. And for the way that evidence is being generated right now, which is rapid, we can't even do it on fields anymore. Where potentially you'd be able to say, I'm going to work out where all the evidence is on this available field. It's just not. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of results in that now. So you need to really determine what are you trying to find here and have a very strict eligibility criteria and use that eligibility criteria to ask the questions that matter most and then help that refine your search strategy in place.
Fantastic. And just one last question related to this one, actually. Can you just confirm for us what grey literature is?
Yes.
We should have started with that at the beginning.
No, it's a great, I think, so I've got to hear that grey literature is the information not controlled by commercial publishing and can include things like conference abstracts, thesis, government reports, patents, clinical practice guidelines, for example. And I would even say things like blogs, so people can put blogs on. For example, when we're looking at that scoping review, they were just looking at the resources available. Now, they weren't looking to say, do those resources actually say the correct information? That's another thing to consider, but they were just saying, websites and blogs and discussion posts that a person who is trying to manage breast milk would be able to find.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for confirming that. So then the next question that I kind of want to bring up is one that I think we received the most times, kind of when people were registering for this webinar. And I think it's going to be of a lot of interest for many of our attendees now, based on kind of the questions that are coming in. And that's, we know that data extraction is probably the hardest part of any kind of literature review, whether it's a systematic review or a narrative review or a scoping review. It is really hard to do. But how would you go about data extraction or data charting in a scoping review? And especially, how do you manage the qualitative or the textual evidence?
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question. So before I start, let's break down some principles. Because if you were like me, when you first started your scoping review, you wanted to extract absolutely everything. And I mean everything. And you actually don't have to. You don't need to. No one needs that much information because you need to only extract what is relevant. And what I mean is what is relevant to answering the questions that you have decided are relevant. And you've got to trust yourself that you made those questions for a reason. So don't deviate unless there is an absolute need to. Let's avoid the deviation if we have to, because we made that protocol when we were a lot clearer of mind. We've finished title and abstract. We're getting a little bit exhausted, and we need to remind ourselves of why we're doing this, and that is to answer those questions. So only extract what is relevant. Multiple reviewers to extract data to minimize bias. I used to be like, oh, one person. But then I realized just how many mistakes I can make as a person when it comes to extraction. So having at least someone check over your work is best practice. Having very well developed extraction tools or forms that you have made to suit your review. The standardized forms or tools rarely fit a scoping review because, again, we are quite generative in trying to find our answer. So one of the good things about, there's many good things about Covenants, but one of the great things I love about Covenants is the data extraction version 2 that you have, where you can develop an extraction form from scratch. And you will need to do that to be able to answer your question. Trial your extraction form. And if you're including multiple different evidence sources, so you're including observational studies, a discussion paper, a guideline, and you're like, we're including all of that, trial each version of that on your extraction form, because that's going to help you go, yes, this is suited for all evidence sources. And I cannot emphasize enough to keep careful records here. Now, what is your extraction table going to look like when it's finished? Organized chaos. You're probably going to open the export that you get from Covenants in an Excel, cry a little, shut it down, have a cup of tea, and then go back to it, because it's going to look messy. And everyone's looks messy at this stage, okay? It will come together when you start doing the analysis. So ways to help you with extraction, especially if you have multiple extractors. And there's never been a time when it's just been myself and someone else. There's always been myself and a team to extract. I've been very lucky. But what that means is that I need to make sure that everyone is on the same page as me. That what I extract and what I think should be extracted is the exact same thoughts as someone else is. Because you don't want to go through hundreds of extractions to realize that they actually misinterpreted something. So I develop extraction information sheets. We do extraction piloting together. We meet once a week to be able to discuss our extractions or any concerns we have over extractions. Because the quicker that you solve an issue, the quicker it's going to be easier to handle, and you're not having to go redo a full load of extraction based on a simple misunderstanding. Now, for example, even how things are written, because how we extract is going to directly affect how you then analyze and how quickly you can get to the analysis. For example, the word Australia. If you're like, what is the country? And you're like, okay, one person's writing Australia, one person is writing AUS. Oz. That's going to impact your analysis. So you want to make things as clear as possible and the exact same as possible. And again, Covidence is great because you can predefine all that and someone can just click it and it's the same thing coming up every time. So make sure that it's all clear. But where do I extract from? Anywhere that is relevant, but it's often not the results section. We're not here to extract the significance or the confidence intervals here. If you need that information, then maybe you need to consider that what you're doing with it is actually a systematic review. So really consider why you're extracting the results. Now, I'm going to show you what one of my extraction forms look like. And this is what I mean about organized chaos. And this is me trying to have cleaned it up a little bit. Overwhelming. It is simply overwhelming. So, and this is probably the cleanest one I've seen. So this is on our patient journey mapping one. And as you can see, this is the export of what Covidence gave us. And as you can see, we've got all of these in columns that we'll be able to easily calculate and provide descriptive statistics on it all. This is also what it looks like in Covidence. This is another review. And as I said, you can predefine all of this, which is absolutely phenomenal. Now, I like to use every software and like to push it to the very edge of its capabilities, including Covidence. And I am a huge fan of Covidence. But I will say, if you are going to include a table, which is a brilliant table, I loved it, and I loved that I was able to do that. The only time that it becomes an issue is when you're then doing consensus, because unless someone actually put it in the exact order as you, it's really hard to get consensus on it. But that's the only issue that I've seen with it. And again, this is what it looks like when you deal with your conflicts as well. So in managing contextual information, that was the biggest question that we had. And I've got a whole section on how do I manage qualitative textual evidence. Do you just want me to go ahead, Julie?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we kind of discuss that. The other kind of questions that are coming through quite a bit are about using, should I be extracting p-values and standard deviations? I think you've kind of covered that in that if that's the kind of outcome data you're looking for, then maybe scoping reviews aren't the right review for your research question. But it'd be great if you could just kind of confirm that, and yet definitely then move on to how we can capture that qualitative and really rich data that scoping reviews give us.
Yes. The quick and dirty answer is no, don't. You don't need to, because again, you need to think about, what am I going to do with that? What is my intention of that collection of evidence? If that is then used to do a meta-analysis or some form of, I question and go, we will never do a meta-analysis in a scoping review ever. Absolutely do not do it. That is a systematic review that requires risk of bias assessment and to use very, very comprehensive methods here. So I would just like to say no. So the next thing that we have is, well, how do you manage qualitative textual evidence? Now, this is when it comes to the case that extraction can actually be the first step in data analysis here. So one of the questions that we often get is, how do I manage qualitative evidence? And we'll get a lot of textual-based evidence in scoping reviews. That's just, again, the nature of the work that we're trying to answer. And the best way that we can do this is often when you need to decide, how am I going to organize this information? And I'll get into the different approaches then. So just to, again, background, many ways in which data can be analyzed. You will not be doing a meta-analysis though. If you are using a meta-analysis, I hope that our guidance is not cited, because we very clearly say, do not do a meta-analysis in a scoping review. But you're most likely going to use things like simple frequency counts, narrative summaries. The qualitative analysis becomes a little bit more interesting, and this is where I think scoping reviews do really well in. But with confines here. We are not doing meta-aggregation, meta-ethnography, thematic synthesis. Those require quite a deeper level of interpretation that, again, a systematic review of qualitative evidence, it probably aligns to more. What we're generally doing is very basic qualitative content analysis where we are categorizing textual evidence, not interpreting. There's a small level, but not to the deeper level of interpretation that we'll see in the other forms of that I've mentioned before. So let's go through a bit of a piloting or an example here. Barriers and facilitators is probably a best one. So what you're going to do is you're probably going to have a coding thing of barriers, and you're going to extract all the barriers that you see being mentioned in the papers just into that section. And whilst you're extracting, just leave all of those there. Because what you're then doing is doing this inductive approach. So the inductive is a process where you're going to develop a theory framework during the analysis and the extraction process. So that's where you're going to take those barriers that you've extracted, and then you're going to develop their own framework and then essentially re-extract it and, get the information. However, if you have barriers and facilitators and there is a framework, essentially that's already about all the barriers and frameworks regarding, or barriers and enablers on that particular issue, and you can just essentially extract directly into that framework, that's perfect. So, for example, again, my PhD student who is working on people with lived experience in guidelines, she can use the Gin McMaster extension for engagement. And that means that she can go, yes, that is how, when a person was engaged in that level of time of the guideline, and here is a small narrative or verbatim extraction of when that occurred. So that's already being done for her, and then she can take those and then do some descriptives on that. That's great, because that's the work done for you. The hardest bit is the inductive, when you've got to develop the framework. And essentially what we'll do is, here's all the barriers. I'm then going to take all those barriers, read through them, do a process of this initial open coding and thoughts. We're like, oh, that sounds like this, that sounds like that. You're going to then develop a coding framework, and then you're going to organize all those extractions into that new framework. And that will help you develop those new categories. So for example, this was on the strengths of simulated clinical placement. And what we had here is that there were 17 categories or strengths identified, and this was all through inductive coding. So this was the verbatim extraction here. Students and program facilitators evaluated the teaching environment and resources positively. So all of those three led to some open coding of time, repetition, and continuous practice. That then led to what we would call the finalized category, and that was opportunities to pause and repeat tasks. And then what that extracted information all went into was into that finalized category there. And then ultimately what we did and presented was the finalized category name, a verbatim extraction of an example of what was extracted into it, and the number of extractions that were put into there. So that could tell us to say that this strength was mentioned 20 times, this strength was mentioned 10 times. Now, this is quite a lot of group work here of us going back and forth and looking together. And just another thing here is just to plan your data extraction and your analysis. So I'm now putting these in my protocols, and basically each of these review questions, what the data format, how it will be analysed, and then how it will be presented. So all of these decisions are made when I have a lot more of a clearer mind than at the end of title and abstract screening and extraction, where my mind is a little bit more kerfuddled.
Wonderful. And I think it's really important to kind of emphasize, the planning, the protocol is really key. Thinking ahead about what you want to, what your question is, how you want to find that information, what data you need, how you're going to present it. It's really, really important to set out in advance for the whole team.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
So another question that's come up many times and that I get asked a lot as well is around about how you assess or if you assess the risk of bias in a scoping review.
This is my favorite question. It really is, because it's just like a one slide response of no. Um, no. The only time that I would say critical appraisal should be done in a scoping review is if you're trying to maybe make a general comment on the methodology of the articles, not to then use that information for them to use it for clinical practice recommendations or statements. So more as a, this is what the general quality of these articles were, but to make a statement of the fact that maybe this field needs to be improved or that the field's in the right direction methodologically. But I would not want to do that unless, again, that is part of a question that needs to be answered. And I'm very much of we do a lot of work in scoping reviews. We don't need to make more work of ourselves.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And then another question is around, so you've completed your data extraction, your data charting. Now, what are some good ways to be able to present that data in your final report or your publication or your thesis? Are there some good tools out there that can help you generate those kind of visual outputs that we see in scoping reviews?
Yes, there are some great tools, and I wish I was better at them. Anyone that is good at data visualization, please email me and teach me, because I want to know all your ways. But I just want to say here, you have so much flexibility when it comes to presenting your information. Please do not provide table after table after table. It is arduous to read. Death by table is what I used to call it. I would love to be us to be more inventive visually. I would love journal editors to be more accepting of more beautiful imagery within our work. That is still something that we're hopefully moving on to. But presentation can really just be as pretty or as basic as possible. So this is one here where it has been a table where we essentially were looking at the definitions that we had on simulated clinical placements. We had the author, the definition verbatim, and then we had some key features of each definition. We'd found 6 key features of it, and we basically said which of these definitions was that feature showing. So I'm not saying I'm anti-table, but what I'm saying is I don't want a whole bunch of tables. And everything must have a narrative approach to it. So for example, for that table, this was the narrative that was around it. So easy to read. You can go more in depth and you can do a scoping review with an evidence and gap map. So this is what we did for the simulated clinical placement, where basically we had, did this paper talk about why simulated clinical placements should be done, the methods of simulated clinical placements, the resources used, and in what field did we see that in. And then we were able to put that up and people can visually see all those articles and have it organized. It also showed where simulated clinical placement were being conducted in what field. So we can see very little in nutrition or myotherapy, but a lot in nursing. And then we've got this word cloud. This is a word cloud I developed because I found in one scoping review over 1,000 different terms to describe evidence synthesis. So this was a way to present all of that. You can use things like these type of imagery as well. A very popular one is here, which is a map of where the evidence come from. So we can see that there's very little information coming from South America, quite a lot in Europe, a Western-centric view of evidence in that field. But then we've also got things like the year of publication, bar charts. This was a bit like what we thought of as SWOT. So you listed all the strengths, the weaknesses, the barriers, and the facilitators. as well. So I really just want to emphasize that the world is your oyster here, but ensuring that there is a narrative. Tools that I use is tools like Data Wrapper. That's a very user-friendly tool. Power BI is something that I wish I was better at and that I do use. I was using it this morning and realized how much more I have to learn in that. And Excel, that type of stuff. So Data Wrapper provided the two figures you see here. Very easy to get the information. And things like Tableau. So there's many, many different ones that you can use here. Just a bit of a plug here that there is more guidance coming out soon. And we write about all of these issues and provide detailed information, and that's all through our JBI Scoping Review Network website, through the JBI Scoping Review Methods group that have been writing that as well. So, yeah.
Wow. It's Thank you for naming the tools as well, because I think quite a few people are interested in what tools are out there and that can actually be useful for generating some of those images. So that's fantastic. Thank you for those amazing insights and tips on scoping reviews and when and how to use them. And we do have a little bit of time for some additional questions. So if I can ask you to stop sharing,
Yeah.
Danielle, I will just
Wow, there's
put
so
up.
many questions.
There are so many questions. It's unbelievable. I've been trying busily to collate them together while you've been talking. So I'm going to start with one that's around what other common mistakes that you think teams make in working on scoping reviews?
The very first one I will say is when people say that they followed Prisma SCR as conduct guidance. So there's two different types of guidance here. You have conduct guidance, which would be for me, the JBI scoping review guidance, and then you're following reporting guidance, which is the Prisma SCR. Prisma SCR doesn't tell you how to do a review, it tells you how to report your scoping review. So that would probably be my first one. My second one is doing higher levels of analysis than need be. So we see a lot of thematic analysis being used. Definitely always citing the Brown and Clark article, which is a very popular thematic analysis method, but their intention was not for it to be used for secondary evidence. So that's probably something I see a lot. And I think just not being transparent in the methods that they use. So they have kind of gone from they were trying to do a systematic review, then realized that they didn't do all of the aspects of a systematic review, so thought they could downgrade it to a scoping review, not realizing that they're completely different approaches.
Fantastic. Another question that's come up quite a bit that I've seen is around AI, big topic. Uh, so do you have any thoughts about how AI might be used in scoping reviews? Can we use it for our searches, for screening, for content analysis?
Yeah,
What
I
thoughts
think
have you got
that
on that?
I'm a huge fan of AI. I think if AI can do the tasks that can make our process more efficient, I'm all for it. I think AI right now is being very trained for systematic reviews of effects of interventions and not for which have more narrower and more structure in how the questions are being developed. And so therefore they can find those responses quite easily. I think if we're looking at scoping reviews, we've got quite broad questions that which challenge AI. And so I'm hesitant to be like, yes, use these tools for scoping reviews at the moment, because a lot of the testing has been done on very narrow questions of effects. In saying that, there is tools to help us in the process. So theoretically, covenants and using, the screening that we see in covenants can essentially be considered an AI, but it really is just telling you what questions are that, it's reading what you're saying yes and no to, and then prioritizing those questions that should be yes quicker. And then in the end, you should be able to say no, no, no at the end, which should improve efficiencies. I think in the future, we'll see AI help us screen, especially, and that will be hugely beneficial for scoping reviews since we're screening quite a lot because of our broad question. So my thing is, I think in the future, there's a lot more that we're going to be able to do with AI. Its application to scoping reviews at the moment is unproven. And I think we probably have to wait a few more years. But AI keeps rapidly changing.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's very, very quick to change and introduce new things. I think we just have to be able to trust AI, whatever kind of review that we're doing, and not just take it for granted that it's got the correct response
Yeah,
for us. The accuracy is really important, whatever kind of review we're working on.
yeah, agree.
Um, Another question that's come up several times is about kind of registering protocols for scoping reviews. So called when we're looking at systematic reviews, it's recommended to register them, and we're told that there are a certain number of registries that are really useful. What about scoping reviews?
Yeah, so there's no database to register a scoping review, like Prospero. Prospero don't accept scoping reviews. What we do have is platforms where we can share our protocols transparently and place them on. So, for example, Open Science Framework, Figshare. I would always recommend putting your protocol on those platforms to be able to be open in your approach, and in the spirit of open science, and be transparent and rigorous. But that does not give you a registration. That's just saying, hey, it's up there. We put it, it was preconceived, it was done a priori, our methods.
Great. So I guess, are there any kind of those open access sources that you kind of would recommend? I guess there's things like there's Figshare, like an open science framework. Are there any
Yeah.
others that you would recommend, or that
What
those
I
are the main ones?
personally use is open science framework. You then have the choice if you then want to publish a protocol, but that is a choice and not an actual, like, you have to publish it. Publishing is, a cost associated with it. It's very hard to publish protocols of evidence synthesis, especially publishing scope and review protocols. So I wouldn't say that publishing is a requirement, but I would say putting it up and writing a protocol is a requirement, and putting it up somewhere where you can link it to the manuscript.
Absolutely. So it's more about having that kind of transparency
Yeah.
somewhere in the public arena.
Yes, a scoping review should be as transparent, as rigorous as a systematic review.
Fantastic. Another question that keeps coming through is that, I guess it goes back to the breadth of scoping reviews and the huge volume that people are coming up against when they're doing their searching. And so there have been questions kind of in opposing directions as to, is there a minimum number of papers to be included in a scoping review, or is there a maximum number of papers? Do you have any thoughts on that?
There are no minimum and no maximum. You could have an empty scoping review. Empty reviews in themselves have been considered. There's a whole discussion about the need for them. So I would question why you would do a review that's empty and what is the purpose of doing an empty review. Sometimes it is because we need to be able to highlight that there is no evidence in this field, which is a very valid reason. In terms of the maximum, no, which again is quite a hard thing to understand. Well, not hard to understand, but hard to then navigate, especially those that surprise you. So for that simulated clinical placement, we had been told that there's no evidence, very little. We'll be lucky to reach 20 papers, and we had over 100 articles. So resourcing for a scoping review of 20 versus resourcing for a scoping review of over 100 is vastly different. And you need to be able to be prepared as much as possible if that occurs. And if that occurs, it could be calling on more people to help you. It could be changing the method slightly. So for instead of having two people extract, you'll have one person extract and one person check, but noting that they would lead to limitations that you need to discuss.
Fantastic. Um, we are at the hour, but actually there are so many questions coming in. If people want to stay online, I'm just going to keep asking Danielle a few more questions for another 5 minutes, maybe, just so that because I just love everyone's enthusiasm. I love the engagement that you're all bringing to this webinar. So if you're happy to stay on, please do. If you have to leave, then thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us. Um, so Danielle, we've got some other questions around, I guess, more about the analysis and about the, including content and thematic analysis in a scoping review. Have you got any thoughts on that? Is it one or the other? Is it a combination? What are your thoughts?
So for me, a qualitative content analysis versus a thematic analysis. So the analytical approach, the thematic analysis, for me, how I interpret it is very much based on primary research and philosophies. And the one that I see quoted a lot is the Brown and Clark, and they're very much about reflexivity and being able to go back and to the original source, which is not something that you do in secondary evidence. And in the scoping review, it is very much the categorization of content. So it is there to help organize rather than provide deeper levels of interpretation.
Fantastic. Another question, kind of going back or jumping back to the protocol question, actually, is around, can you change your protocol as you're going through your scoping review? What are the processes involved in making kind of amendments to that document?
So often you'll deviate from your protocol, but I think you need to stop before you deviate. It is, and I think we shouldn't just go, oh yeah, we'll just go our own pathway. You wrote that protocol for a reason. That protocol was agreed to by a team, most likely. Every scoping review should be done by a team. And you trying to deviate, you need to again stop and ask why. Why do I need to deviate from this protocol? What is making me think that I need to deviate? Now, if you have very valid reasons for whatever approach, that's completely fine. It could be, oh, whilst I was extracting, we realized that there was an item that we needed to extract, and we've included that. Again, completely fine. But what I would say is that you be transparent in discussing any deviations and reporting them. So if that's reporting them in a supplementary table or reporting them in your methods, wherever it's allowed, to say there were deviations from our protocol, these are the deviations, and this is why we deviated.
Fantastic. And I totally agree. I think transparency, again, whatever kind of review you're working on, making it clear what you've done when you've made changes is really important.
Yeah.
I've got a question here that's really interesting. So, would you say that the ASCII and O'Malley definitions, I guess, of scoping reviews is now out of date? And should we now use the kind of JBI guidance as our definitions? What do you think?
Yeah, a guidance. Well, JBI built upon the ASCII and Valley framework. So, we used ASCII Malik and the Levac and Colquhoun frameworks, and we've developed the JBI based on our founding scoping review people. And, I have nothing but respect for them. Look, if the ASCII and O'Malley aligns to the way that you would like to do a scoping review, I think that's completely fine. Obviously, ours is now talking about more modern issues within evidence synthesis, as theirs hasn't been updated. But to me, as long as you're using some form of guidance and not just making it up, I'm pretty happy.
Wonderful. I'm just interested at slightly kind of different step around the kind of interest holder consultation, that kind of phase that's recommended as optional in
Yeah.
scoping reviews sometimes. So what do you think about that consultation phase? Is it always required in a scoping review? And if people want to um, use that consultation process, how is that best achieved? That was a very long question.
No, it's a great question. We wrote a whole paper, and the paper became nearly a mini thesis because of the complexities of engaging with interest holders. I think again the question that you need to ask yourself is, why do I want to engage with interest holders? Can I properly facilitate engagement of interest holders within this review process, especially if you're thinking about involving patients and members of the public? It could be very different if you're involving other researchers or policymakers, guideline developers, but we do need to make sure that we are properly going to able to provide the resources of payment to patients and members of the public within a review, and we need to make sure that it's a psychologically safe environment. If you can say that you can do that adequately, then yes, please include interest holders in your review. It does nothing but strengthen your review. The times when I've been able to do it, it's been a fantastic experience where I can say that the results have been better for it. And I can, see huge benefits in doing it. The level of engagement is also something to consider. So you've got levels of engagement from co-authorship, where they're co-researchers with you, all the way to this consultation where maybe they've just been, you're emailing them, they're giving you some advice, or at the very end of the process, they're looking at the findings and providing a deeper level of interpretation for you. So many, many things to consider and to discuss. If the question is relevant, I would highly recommend doing that, but to do it early and develop those relationships.
Fantastic. I think that's really great advice. Yeah, I appreciate that. Um, Another question that's coming in kind of several times, I guess, is around review framework and approaches. So within scoping reviews, we use the PCC framework. How do you think that works for reviewers in terms of structuring their entire review, how and developing their research questions and guiding their search strategies and guiding how they plan their kind of data extraction template, their charting template, for example?
Yeah, so how we frame our research question, which would be the PCC, so population, concept, and context. Now, you don't have to have the entire PCC in a scoping review. So there's been times when I've just had a concept, so I just had a C. Now, the implications of that, though, is that I've got a much broader search, a much broader eligibility criteria, and my extraction is going to be a little bit messier as I am very inductive in that approach. The PCC should align with what your research questions are, what your objectives are, and all of that will provide a really nice foundation to your development of search strategy all the way to your answering your questions. So it is so vital to focus on that protocol stage and invest in that time to work out what those research questions are, how the PCC and search and how it all aligns together.
Brilliant. Um, just looking to see if there are any other questions that are coming in. I guess one thing I'm interested in is kind of it's not really about risk of bias, but it's about thinking about the kind of levels of evidence that might be included in your scoping review. So my review might include randomized control trials, and it might include cohort studies, or it might include case control studies. So when I'm thinking about how I report that evidence, do I prioritize randomized trials over other designs, or within scoping reviews, are all designs equal?
Yeah, for me, all designs would be equal. in the review questions that I'm asked, in the types of questions that I'm asking. In a systematic review, I would probably go, I'm going to go randomized control trials first, and then if there's nothing, I'd go maybe to the non-randomized studies, again, depending on the research question. But for me, in a scoping review, I pretty much consider them all equal. I would, go, yes, there's maybe 10 RCTs, 20 observational, that type of stuff, but for the most part, they're equal to me.
Wonderful. Thanks for confirming that. And yeah, I think that's a really good response. I think this will probably be one of the last questions, but how often should we update scoping reviews? When are they kind of out of date?
Oh, fantastic and relevant question. Thank you. So we have actually written this in our newest guidance because we've got this question a bit, and it's so important with the rise of living evidence. And it makes sense. We're doing living systematic reviews, living guidelines, to also have living scoping reviews or updated. And that comes to the concept of updating scoping reviews. It's the same types of things that apply. Has a substantial amount of new evidence come in the last couple of years that could potentially change the results? That would probably be the question I ask the most. If I update the whole update every 10 years rule might not apply in scoping reviews. Again, it depends on, has there been a substantial amount of evidence that could change your results? That would be the question that I'd be reflecting on the most.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I think it is quite important, and especially with the kind of just the general volume of evidence that's being produced, in this particular time now. The number of publications every day is just exponential. So regular updating is probably quite important as things change rapidly in some different fields.
Yeah, I agree.
So thank you, Danielle. I thank you for an amazing discussion. It's been wonderful chatting to you. You've had some wonderful and insightful responses to all of the questions that have come in. I'm sorry to everyone that we haven't been able to answer every single one of your questions here, but I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to attend this webinar. I hope you found it helpful and that you've learned more and that you feel more knowledgeable about scoping reviews and when and how to use them, some tools to use, and some insights into all of the different things that Danielle has explained to us today. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, then feel free to contact the support team after the webinar at support@providence.org. We're always here to help you and provide any information and guidance that we can. Don't forget that you'll receive the recording to the webinar within the next 24 hours, so you can watch it back at any time and you can go back over all of the wonderful discussions that we've just had. And Danielle's slides will be available on our website once they've been uploaded, and you'll be able to access those. So please enjoy the rest of your day. It's been wonderful to have you here. I can't thank you again for the wonderful questions and the engagement that we've had here. Thank you very much. I hope to see you at one of our other webinars in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.